recording, so you tell Jenny another story.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to tell you a story. I always wondered as a kid why we didn't have any babies. All the neighbors had babies, but we never had any. And I don't remember ever asking. I asked my grandmother where they got me, and she said, well, you know, we always had a garden. Said, you know those big old Italian squash leaves, how big they are? Said grandfather was hoeing weeds in the garden, and he heard this noise, and he went over there, and there you were, under that leaf. So he brought you, and that's how we got you. Well, I believed every word of it, so I went down every day and looked under every leaf, and there wasn't no babies there. And my grandmother told me about hummingbirds. We didn't have hummingbirds in West Texas, dry, you know, and hot. So one day I found a hummingbird in an okra bloom. So I pinched it off and hold the top of it. And about halfway to the house, that hummingbird stung me. It was a bumblebee. But anyway, I left home. Our neighbors had a baby, and they lived about a half a mile. So I went up there, and my grandfather had gone to town with a bale of cotton. We had a big crop that year. And Grandma come up there and tried to get me to come back, but I said, no, I'm going to stay up here. So the lady said, oh, let her stay, Mrs. Wood. Said, she can help me bathe the baby, and she can give him his bottle. So I did, but I knew it was wrong because I knew to get home before my grandfather came back from town. And of course, he was in the wagon. It took a while. So I went back home, and nothing was said about it. And when he come in to eat lunch, it's what we call lunch now, but then we called it dinner. He come in to eat. He said, where'd you find Edna? And my grandmother said, well, what do you mean? She wouldn't have told on me. She said, well, Mrs. Jenkins, that's the lady that worked for him, said she ran away from home. And my grandmother said, well, I'll thank Mrs. Jenkins to take care of her business, and I'll take care of mine. She never said anything. And he never either. So after I got through eating, I went in. I always liked to read. And I went in my room, and I laid down on the bed and was reading. And he come in and locked the door with a little rope, not like nothing. And he whipped me with that rope. I thought I'd never had a hit. Nobody had ever hit me. And I was screaming bloody murder. And my grandmother, she always called my grandfather Mr. Woods, unless she was mad at him. She called him George. I heard her call him George twice. She said, George, you open the door, I'll break it down. But he whipped me with that rope. And when I think back now, that wasn't anything. I didn't leave home because I was mad. Yeah. I just left home to go get us a baby. And they'd tell me, you know, the storks brought the baby, and I'd get out and look for storks in that dry weather. There was no storks. But that's the only whipping I ever got in my life. My dad started to spank me once. We didn't come home from school, but this time we were in the 5th or 6th grade. And my sister and I, we just stopped at some of the kids' house and played. Well, by that time, the whole community was out looking for us, you know. Well, my dad was riding a horse, and he come and he gathered me up, and he popped me on the bottom and said, why didn't you come home? And so I hit him back. He had me gathered up, so I just whacked him a good one in the back. He got tickled, and he didn't whip me. He didn't spank me anymore. But
now, you had a story about saying a bad word, and your grandparents wouldn't let you go to school anymore.
We never said a bad word. The only word we could say, we weren't allowed to call anybody, and we were staunch Democrats in those days. But the Democratic Party was a different party to what it is today. But my grandmother's father fought in the Civil War. And after the Civil War, the circuit riders come down, the Yankees, and they'd steal everything the Southern people had. And my grandmother had took her whole year to make 10 yards of cloth on the loom, and they stole that. So they called them Yankees, and we could call people Yankees. So if we had to call somebody a bad name, we called them Yankees. And I still do that. We didn't lose that war. We're just resting. But we'd always do that. We would get aggravated and want to call somebody a bad name. He'd call me Yankee. And Patty say, hey, I was born in Ohio. You know, we're a big family. We argued religion and politics and all the other stuff people argue about, and we all talked at once like a bunch of Italians. And if one of them couldn't get your word in edgeways, you raised your hand, and then they'd stop and let you get your point in. So, your mother she was from a refined family, and she never did that. She never took any part in it. Her and Walt been married about 40 years, and one day we're all arguing, and everybody talking at once, and your mom raises her hand. We all stopped and died laughing. And she said, "Hey, I have an opinion." And then we, now she does it all the time. but I had a real good life as a kid. We never had money. My folks were farmers, and I'm sure my grandfather had a little money, but every year he borrowed money, and he took me with him a lot. We didn't have any boys, so we'd go to town. He'd let me go with him, and they'd taught me good manners. But when we'd go to the bank president was Mr. Lee, and he'd always shake hands with me and ask me how I was, and I felt so grown up when Mr. Lee did that. But one time he came out, and they shook hands when he came out, and then him and Grandpa talked for a while, and he left, and they shook hands again. And I wondered about that. So I asked my grandfather, "Grandpa, why did you shake hands with Mr. Lee when he left?" And he said, "Well, he's going to loan us money to make a crop." And so we shook hands and agreed that I'd pay him back. That's the way they did it in those days. You know. My grandfather was really a smart person. He wasn't well educated, but let's say if they'd get an argument going the Baptists are always fighting, and we were Baptists, they'd get something going in church, well, they'd call on him, they'd get 3 men, and they'd go and they'd settle it there. And that's a lot better than going to court. You take up a lot of money when you do. But they knew that Grandpa would be fair, even though he didn't agree with it. He'd be fair. And Walter's a lot like my grandpa. I am too. I don't know. We never had bad language at our house, never. And my grandmother, I never saw them be affectionate with each other, but they had such respect for each other. She always called him Mr. Woods. I don't think my grandmother ever wrote a check in her life. I never did see her. I don't remember it, but the men just thought that women were kind of prized possessions, but they weren't real bright, according to the men in those days. And when the Second World War come along, men found out women had brains. The men went to war and women went to work, and they found out then that women had a brain of their own. Yeah. See, when I was born, women couldn't vote. And my grandfather wasn't too sure about it. They voted for the first time in 1920. They passed the law in 1919. 1920 they voted. And my grandfather thought the women had water for brains. They couldn't drive a car. When my stepmother would drive a car, my grandpa was afraid she was going to have her. And my grandpa never drove a car in his life. He never drove a car either. When we were young, we either rode a horse or went in a wagon. And usually we went in the wagon. In the little town where we lived, it wasn't very big. And every Saturday, everybody went to town. All the farmers went to town. And we only had one Chinese family in town. They had a laundry, but on Saturday they'd cook Chinese food and put it on a plate and sell it. And my grandmother told me never to eat it because they eat cats. And so I never ate Chinese food till I was in my 40s, because I remember what my grandmother said they ate cats. Now, is that enough stories?
There's never enough stories, Grandma. But that'll work just fine.
Sometimes my dad worked away from home, but sometimes we'd have such a big crop, he'd have to come home and help, pick the cotton. And we'd have a time. People used to